He survived 4 BB gun pellets to the head, but it was his silence that killed him. On May 11, 2022, in a modest flat in Wetstone, North London, 30-year-old Olsie Cuker lay dying, surrounded by torn furniture, shattered drawers, and the chaos of a violent robbery. What his attackers didn't know, what they couldn't have known in their fury and frustration, was that the answer to all their demands was just 6 inches from his head. £8,000 in cash, hidden beneath his headboard. Close enough to touch, but a world away from saving his life. That single discovery, made not by detectives, but by a police dog named Sunflower Monty, would unravel one of North London's most brutal home invasions and send 5 men to prison for a combined century behind bars. But to understand why Olsie stayed silent, why he refused to speak, even with a weapon aimed at his skull, you need to understand who he really was. And that story begins not in the blood-soaked bedroom where he died, but in the careful, calculated double life he'd built in the years before. Welcome to UK True Crime Files. Wetstone is the kind of North London suburb where people know their neighbours by sight, not by name. Quiet streets, modest terraced homes, the occasional corner shop. Nothing remarkable, nothing that draws attention. And that's exactly why Olsie Cuker chose it. Born in Fear, Albania, in the chaotic years following the collapse of communism, Olsie grew up in a country rebuilding itself from instability and economic collapse. By his early 20s, he'd left it all behind, migrating to the United Kingdom in search of opportunity, but not the conventional kind. He settled in Wetstone, sharing a flat with his cousin, Olsie Cuker. On paper, the 2 men couldn't have been more different. Olsie ran a carpentry business back in Albania and a small coffee shop in London. Legitimate, grounded, respectable. Olsie, on the other hand, had found his opportunity in cannabis. To his neighbours, he was invisible. No expensive cars parked outside, no designer clothes, no late-night parties or foot traffic that might raise suspicion. He blended in perfectly, a face in the background, polite if you passed him on the stairs, but never memorable. But on the streets, among those who operated in the same world, Olsie Cuker was known. He was running a cannabis operation that moved hundreds of thousands of pounds in product across the UK. Not flashy, not reckless, calculated, efficient, and quiet. And in the years following the UK's 2018 debates over cannabis legalisation, as Albanian organised crime networks expanded their grip on the supply chain, men like Olsie became valuable. But being known in that world comes with a price, because someone was watching. If you value in-depth UK crime analysis that respects victims and evidence alike, consider subscribing. We're just getting started. May 6, 2022, 4 days before the attack. A black Mercedes-Benz appears on CCTV footage circling Olsie Cuker's building in Wetstone. Once, twice, 3 times. Slow, deliberate passes, the kind that aren't accidental. The driver isn't lost, he's studying. Over the next 72 hours, that same vehicle returns. Different times of day, different angles, but always the same target. Olsie's flat. They were building a blueprint. Inside those 2 black Mercedes were 5 men, each with a role to play. This wasn't opportunistic, this was organized. At the center of it all was Ozan Saran, 28 years old, no fixed address. According to prosecution evidence presented at trial, Saran was the architect, the man who identified the target, assembled the team, and set the plan in motion. He brought muscle. Deji Ramsey, 25, from East London. Santana Thompson, 21, from Waltham Forest. And the youngest, Reuben Bernard, just 17 years old, from Northampton, with no serious criminal history. Yet. Then there were the drivers. Boulant Bakia, 27, from Enfield, would wait behind the wheel of one Mercedes. Thompson would drive the second. 2 cars, 5 men, 1 target. The plan was simple: break in, take the drugs and cash they believed Olsie was sitting on, and disappear into the night. Fast, brutal, and gone before anyone could respond. What they didn't anticipate was resistance. What they didn't know was that Olsie Cuker would never give them what they came for. And on the night of May 10, 2022, that silence would turn a robbery into a murder. May 10, 2022. Just after midnight, 2 black Mercedes moved through the quiet streets of Wetstone, headlights cutting through the darkness. No sirens, no witnesses, just the hum of engines and the weight of what's about to happen. They park, engines running, doors left open for a fast exit. 3 men step out, faces covered with COVID-style masks, hands gripping butcher knives. One carries a BB gun. They move toward the building in silence, practiced, deliberate. Inside the flat, Olsie Cuker and his cousin Alush are asleep. The entry is soundless. No forced lock, no shattered glass. Just the soft click of a door and 3 figures slipping into the darkness. They head for Alush's room first. The door swings open. Alush wakes to shadows standing over him, to shouted demands he barely understands. Where are the drugs? Where's the money? The room is torn apart. Drawers yanked open, mattress overturned, every corner searched. But there's nothing. No stash, no cash, just confusion and rising panic. Furious, one of the men lashes out. A knife slashes across Alush's face and body. Fists follow. He's beaten, bleeding, gasping, but he has nothing to give them. So they move to the next room, Olsie's room. He's cornered now, outnumbered, nowhere to run. 3 men, 2 knives, 1 gun. They demand the same thing: drugs, money, everything they know he has. But Olsie doesn't speak. He doesn't plead, doesn't negotiate, doesn't point them toward the headboard just inches away, where £8,000 in cash sits hidden. He stays silent. And that silence enrages them. One of the attackers raises the BB gun and fires. Once, twice, 3 times, 4 times. Metal pellets slam into Olsie's skull at close range, embedding themselves in bone. But still, he says nothing. To the men standing over him, it wasn't just resistance, it was disrespect, a refusal to submit, a challenge they couldn't tolerate. So they made a decision. If he wouldn't talk, he wouldn't leave alive. The knives came next. Multiple stab wounds to the chest, deep, penetrating injuries to his right leg. Blood spreading across the floor, across the bedding, across everything. Olsie Cuker was dying, and the 3 men responsible didn't look back. They turned, walked out of the flat, and climbed into the waiting Mercedes. Within minutes, they were gone. But in their rage, in their frustration at leaving empty-handed, they'd made a mistake that would unravel everything. Alush Cuker lay on the floor of his room, slashed and beaten, barely conscious. But he was alive, and in the fog of pain and shock, he found the strength to do one thing: hit the panic button. Emergency services arrived within minutes. Police, paramedics, the flashing blue lights cutting through the stillness of Wetstone at nearly 1 in the morning. They entered the flat and were met with a scene of devastation. Blood on the walls, furniture overturned, the unmistakable signs of extreme violence. Alush was rushed to hospital, critical but stable. But in the next room, there was nothing anyone could do. Olsie Cuker was dead. A post-mortem examination would later reveal the full horror of what he'd endured. Multiple stab wounds, deep and deliberate, and embedded in his skull, 4 metal ball bearings fired from a BB gun at close range. He had suffered immensely before he died. But the investigation had already begun. Detectives sealed the scene, photographed every inch, catalogued every piece of evidence. This wasn't a random attack. The planning, the surveillance, the coordinated entry, this was organized crime. And then came the breakthrough, not from forensic analysis, not from witness statements, but from a police dog. Sunflower Monty, a cash detection dog trained to locate hidden currency, was brought in to sweep the flat. And within minutes, Monty made the discovery that would change everything. Hidden beneath the cover of Olsie's headboard, untouched and invisible to the naked eye, £8,000 in cash. The very thing the attackers had come for. The thing they'd tortured 2 men to find. The thing they'd killed for. It had been there all along, just 6 inches from Olsie's head. That discovery did more than solve a mystery. It proved motive. It proved the robbery had failed, and it gave investigators the final piece they needed to connect the dots. Because the attackers had left empty-handed, but they hadn't left without a trace. CCTV had captured the black Mercedes circling the building in the days before. Phone records would soon reveal communication between the 5 men in the hours leading up to the attack. And automatic number plate recognition cameras, the silent watchers on every major road in London, had tracked both vehicles from Wetstone to their destinations across the city. The net was closing, and it led police straight to 2 black Mercedes and the men who'd driven them. Cases like this are solved with patience, forensics, and detail. If you appreciate that approach, a quick subscribe helps us keep covering them. May 16th, 2022, 5 days after the murder. 2 men were arrested and charged with the robbery and murder of Olsie Cuker. Bülent Bakia, 27, one of the getaway drivers, and Deji Ramsey, 25, one of the men who'd entered the flat. But the investigation was far from over. In modern policing, violence leaves 2 trails. The physical one, blood, fingerprints, DNA, and the digital one, the invisible web of phones, cameras, and vehicles that map every movement across a city. And in London, that web is tighter than almost anywhere else. CCTV footage had already placed the black Mercedes at the scene. Now, investigators began tracing their routes backward. Every junction, every petrol station, every traffic camera between Wetstone and the suspect's home addresses. Automatic number plate recognition, ANPR, captured both vehicles travelling through North London in the hours before and after the attack. Time-stamped, geolocated, irrefutable. Then came the phone records. Cell tower data placed multiple suspects in close proximity to one another in the lead-up to May 10th. Messages, calls, movement patterns, all pointing to coordination, to planning, to joint enterprise. And under UK law, joint enterprise is a powerful tool. It means that everyone involved in a crime, even those who didn't strike the fatal blow, can be held equally responsible if they knowingly participated in an act that led to death. The prosecution would use it to devastating effect. Within weeks, 3 more arrests followed. Santana Thompson, 21, the second getaway driver. Ozan Saran, 28, the alleged mastermind, the man who'd identified Olsie as a target and assembled the team. And Ruben Bernard, just 17 years old, one of the 3 who'd entered the flat that night. 5 men, 2 cars, and a web of digital evidence they couldn't escape. But as the case moved toward trial, the question wasn't just who had done it. It was who was most responsible. Late May 2023. More than a year after Olsie Cuker's murder, the 5 accused men stood trial at the Old Bailey, one of the most famous criminal courts in the world. The courtroom was packed. Family members sat in quiet grief, some unable to hold back tears as the prosecution laid out the events of that night in meticulous, harrowing detail. CCTV footage showed the black Mercedes circling Wetstone in the days before the attack. Phone records mapped the communication between the 5 men. Forensic evidence linked them to the scene. And then there was the £8,000, hidden beneath the headboard, untouched, a silent witness to the violence that had unfolded just inches away. the prosecution's case was clear. This was a planned, coordinated robbery that had escalated into murder. And under the principle of joint enterprise, every man who played a role bore responsibility for Olsie's death. But the defense teams painted different pictures. For Ruben Bernard, the 17-year-old, they argued youth, immaturity, and susceptibility to influence. For the drivers, Bakia and Thompson, they argued lesser involvement, men who stayed outside, who didn't wield the knives. For Ozan Saran, the alleged mastermind, they argued lack of direct participation. He hadn't entered the flat, hadn't struck a single blow. The jury deliberated, and when they returned, the verdicts were unanimous. Guilty. All 5 men were convicted, but the sentences reflected the court's assessment of individual culpability. Ruben Bernard, despite his age, received the harshest punishment. 29 years for murder, an additional 3 years for causing grievous bodily harm to Olsie Cuker. 32 years total. The judge's reasoning was clear. Bernard had been one of the 3 inside the flat. He had participated directly in the violence, and his actions, the court found, were ruthless. Deji Ramsey and Santana Thompson each received 22 years, 11 for manslaughter, 10 for conspiracy to rob, and 1 year for unlawful wounding. Bülent Bakia, the getaway driver who never entered the flat, received 6 years for conspiracy to rob. The court acknowledged his lesser role, but made clear that driving the vehicle, waiting outside, enabling the crime, still carried consequences. And Ozan Saran, the man prosecutors described as the orchestrator, received just over 24 years. 12.5 for manslaughter, 11.5 for conspiracy to rob, and 9 months for wounding. 5 men, a combined century of imprisonment. From the reconnaissance on May 6th to the convictions in May 2023, 13 months of investigation, 5 sentences, and 1 family destroyed. But the story didn't end in the courtroom. Olsie Cuker survived that night, but survival doesn't mean escape. He carries the scars, physical and psychological, of watching his cousin murdered in the next room, of being slashed, beaten, and left bleeding while 3 strangers tore apart his home, searching for something he didn't have. He was a witness, a survivor, and a family member. 3 roles no one should have to carry at once. For the community of Wetstone, the murder shattered the quiet anonymity that had made the area feel safe. Neighbors who once passed Olsie on the street without a second thought now knew what had been happening behind closed doors. It raised uncomfortable questions. How many other flats housed operations like his? How many quiet faces hid dangerous secrets? But beyond Wetstone, the case resonated across wider conversations already unfolding in the UK. Albanian organised crime networks had become a growing focus for law enforcement in the years leading up to 2022. Cannabis cultivation, particularly large-scale operations using residential properties, had surged, and cases like Olsie's highlighted the violence that could erupt when those networks collided. With each other, with rivals, or with opportunistic criminals looking for quick cash. The sentences handed down at the Old Bailey also sent a message about joint enterprise. Even those who didn't wield the knives, who stayed in the cars, who planned but didn't participate directly, could face decades in prison if their actions contributed to a death. It's a legal principle that divides opinion. Some see it as essential for holding organized criminals accountable. Others argue it casts the net too wide, punishing people for crimes they didn't directly commit. But in this case, the court was unambiguous. From Ozan Saran, who orchestrated the raid, to Bülent Bakia, who sat in the getaway car, all 5 men bore responsibility. And yet, amid the legal outcomes and the policy debates, there's a human truth that remains. Olsie Cuker was more than a cannabis operator. He was a son, a cousin, a man who'd crossed borders in search of something better. His choices led him into a dangerous world, but those choices didn't make his death any less tragic, or the violence inflicted on him any less brutal. His family mourns him, not the empire, not the operation, but the person. And there's one question the trial couldn't fully answer, one question that haunts the edges of this case. Why did he stay silent? In the end, this case comes down to a single, devastating irony. £8,000 in cash, hidden 6 inches from Olsie Cuker's head. Close enough to touch, close enough to hand over, close enough to save his life. But by the time anyone found it, it was already too late. That money couldn't stop the knives. It couldn't undo the violence, but it could, and did, help bring 5 men to justice. It proved the robbery had failed. It proved motive. And in the hands of a police dog named Sunflower Monty, it became the breakthrough that unraveled an entire conspiracy. From the surveillance footage captured days before the attack, to the ANPR cameras that tracked 2 black Mercedes across London, to the phone records that mapped coordination between 5 men. This was a case solved not by luck, but by patient, methodical detective work. And that matters, because behind every conviction, behind every sentence handed down at the Old Bailey, there are investigators who refuse to let violence go unanswered, who traced the digital trails, who followed the evidence, who built a case solid enough to stand up in court. 5 men are now serving a combined century in prison. Reuben Bernard, just 17 at the time, will spend 32 years behind bars. Ozan Saran, the orchestrator, 24 years. Deji Ramsey and Santana Thompson, 22 years each. And Boulant Bakir, 6 years for his role as a driver. The law held them accountable, not just for what they did individually, but for what they enabled collectively. And Olsie Cuker, a man who lived 2 lives, one quiet and one dangerous, is remembered by his family not for the empire he built, but for the person he was. A son, a cousin, a man who crossed borders, who made choices, who lived and died in the shadows of a world most will never see. His story is tragic, but it's also a reminder that justice, even in the most complex cases, even when victim and perpetrator occupy the same grey spaces, still matters. If you value careful, evidence-based reporting on UK crime, cases told with respect for victims and accountability for facts, consider subscribing. We're committed to covering these stories the way they deserve to be told. Not for clicks, but for clarity. And if you remember this case, or if you're from North London and this story touched your community, share your thoughts below. Respectfully, thoughtfully, because these aren't just stories, they're lives, and they deserve to be heard.